Boston, 1852, a city of cobblestones and whispers. The streets flicker with the dull glow of gas lamps, their light barely piercing the fog that rolls in from the harbor. Carriage wheels rattle over uneven stones, carrying gentlemen in top hats and ladies wrapped in heavy gowns, bound by the rules of propriety that Victorian society clings to so tightly. Boston is a city that prides itself on order, on morality, on appearances. But beneath the surface, in its drawing rooms and hidden alleyways, darker stories unfold, ones that society prefers to bury rather than confront. In this rigid world, wealth is more than money. It is reputation. It is bloodline. It is survival. A name must not only be respected, it must endure. For families of standing, having heirs is not a matter of choice. It is an obligation. This is where our story begins. Somewhere in the heart of Boston, behind iron gates and thick curtains, lives a woman who is both admired and feared. The neighbors know her only as the widow. Her name is rarely spoken aloud. Instead, it is carried in murmurs, in glances exchanged at church pews and in careful whispers passed at dinner tables. She is wealthy beyond measure, the beneficiary of her late husband's fortune, and yet she carries an aura of tragedy that clings to her like perfume. To the outside world, she is the very image of respectability. Dressed in somber gowns of black silk, she appears at social gatherings with an expression of cold dignity, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if measuring the worth of every person she encounters. Those who meet her rarely forget the way she seems to calculate them, as though she is constantly weighing fortunes, reputations, and usefulness. Yet rumors persist. They say the widow has become reclusive, avoiding the frivolities of society. They say she speaks less of charity and more of legacy. They say she obsesses over her daughters with a ferocity that unsettles even her closest acquaintances. Her daughters are never far from her side, young women who should have been the gems of Boston society. Yet for reasons no one can quite agree upon, suitors never stay. Some claim the daughters are too quiet, too strange, as though shadows follow them wherever they go. Others whisper that it is the widow herself, her suffocating control, her chilling presence. That drives potential husbands away. But the truth is far more unsettling. In the candlelit halls of her mansion, the widow walks alone at night. Her mind consumed not by grief, but by calculation. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoes through the silence, each passing second a reminder that her family name, her legacy, teeters on the edge of extinction. To lose her daughters to spinsterhood would not merely be embarrassing, it would be ruinous. In a society that values women for the heirs they produce, childless daughters would mark the end of her bloodline, the decay of everything she believes she has built. And so, the widow begins to imagine a solution, one that is neither moral nor legal, but one that, in her eyes, could preserve the family name at any cost. Behind closed doors, her mind drifts to schemes too disturbing to speak aloud. What if society's rules could be bent? What if her fortune could buy the future her daughters could not secure on their own? The city outside continues its restless hum, merchants shouting at the docks, ministers preaching morality from pulpits, children playing along alleys slick with rain. But inside her grand home, silence rules. Only the faint scratching of a quill across paper breaks it, as the widow begins to draft letters, inquiries, notes of invitation, messages not meant for gentlemen of standing, but for those far below them. Young men with nothing, young men who might do anything, for the right price. Boston knows nothing yet of what is to come. For now, the scandal is still only a seed, hidden deep within the mind of one woman who refuses to let her family fade. But soon that seed will take root. And when it does, it will grow into a story of obsession, corruption, and shame, a story whispered through Boston for generations. Because the widow is not mourning. She is plotting. Before Boston whispered her name in scandal, she had been someone else, someone younger, someone softer, someone who once believed in love. The widow's story begins in another decade, when she was not yet a widow at all, but a bride. She had married into fortune, Her husband, a wealthy industrialist whose mills poured smoke into the Boston skies and whose ships carried goods across the Atlantic. He was older than her, much older, but his wealth erased the gap between them in the eyes of society. For her, the marriage was not unusual. Young women were taught that love was secondary to security, that a husband's fortune was worth more than a husband's affection. Still, she had played the role of dutiful wife with precision. She smiled when expected, she charmed his business partners, she bore his last name as if it were a crown, but crowns are heavy. And so was the silence of their household. He was a man who cared little for tenderness. His affections were rare, his words often clipped, his presence more commanding than comforting. Their home, grand as it was, felt more like a stage than a sanctuary. Servants scurried under the weight of his authority, and she, though adorned with jewels and gowns, lived in a cage of expectations. Then one winter evening, it ended. Her husband fell ill suddenly, a sickness that swept through his body faster than doctors could understand. Within weeks he was gone. Boston society turned its gaze to her, the grieving widow draped in black, clutching her daughters close as the funeral bells tolled. But beneath her veil of sorrow, something stirred. When the will was read, it was revealed that her husband had left her not just comfortable, but powerful. She inherited lands, mills, accounts, and investments. She, who had once been seen only as his possession, now possessed everything. It was an intoxicating transformation. In a city where women were expected to be silent, she suddenly had influence. Wealth flowed through her hands, and with it came a taste of freedom that few women of her time could ever dream of. But freedom can twist into something else. Loneliness soon became her constant companion. Though society extended hands of sympathy, she noticed how quickly they recoiled when her independence became too visible, too threatening. A woman with fortune but no husband was both admired and feared. Men saw opportunity, women saw danger, and she saw herself surrounded by vultures. Her daughters grew beneath her watchful eyes, delicate creatures in silk dresses, taught to walk straight, speak softly, and obey without question. They became her world, the fragile vessels into which she poured her fears and her ambitions. But as the years passed, her anxieties deepened. She began to notice how families whispered when her daughters entered the room. Suitors approached, but something, whether it was her controlling presence or some unspoken rumor, always seemed to drive them away. Marriage proposals never materialized. One by one, possibilities vanished until only disappointment remained. The widow could not escape the thought. What would happen if her daughters never married? What if her line ended with them? What if all she and her husband had built dissolved into nothing more than gossip and memory? This was the wound that festered inside her, the fear of oblivion. At night, when the house was still, she walked the halls in silence, her hand gliding over portraits of ancestors long gone. Their painted eyes seemed to judge her, to whisper accusations that she was failing her duty to the family name. She would stand for hours before her husband's portrait, his stern gaze seeming to demand more from her even in death. It was then, in those sleepless hours, that her thoughts began to turn dark. If society would not give her daughters husbands, then she would find another way. If men of standing would not secure her bloodline, then perhaps men of lower station could. She began to wonder what fortune might buy, what desperate souls might agree to, for money, for food, for shelter. The widow's past was not merely a tale of grief. It was a slow descent into obsession, shaped by a lifetime of restraint, fueled by wealth and sharpened by fear. By the time the city began to notice her eccentricities, it was already too late. The woman they had once pitied as a grieving widow had become something else entirely. A mother willing to cross the line between desperation and depravity. Her daughters, still obedient, still silent, had no idea what plans their mother's mind was weaving. But soon, they would. They were the kind of young women who should have thrived in Boston society, with delicate features, refined manners, and the advantage of wealth behind them. The widow's daughters should have been courted, celebrated, and married off into families of equal standing. But instead, they lived as if trapped in shadows, watched, controlled, and spoken of only in hushed tones. There were 3 of them, each different in temperament, yet bound together by the same suffocating hand. The eldest carried herself with a quiet dignity, as if she understood her role was to be her mother's mirror, obedient, cold, untouchable. She rarely smiled, rarely laughed, her life a performance of restraint. The second daughter had a softer soul. She was often seen gazing out of windows for hours, longing for something beyond the iron gates of their estate. And the youngest, though not yet hardened by years of obedience, still carried within her a spark of defiance that flickered against her mother's will. But that spark was small, and the widow knew how to extinguish flames before they became fire. Society noticed their absence at gatherings. Other families brought their daughters to concerts, teas, and charity events, parading them before eligible bachelors. The widow's daughters were rarely permitted such exposure, and when they did appear, the room seemed to grow colder. Whispers followed them, not because of scandal that could be proven, but because of something intangible, something in the way their eyes avoided others, in the way their mother's presence loomed behind them like a shadow too long to escape. Suitors came, of course, men attracted to their wealth, to the prospect of marrying into fortune. But the widow was always there, her questions sharp, her expectations suffocating. Few men wished to court daughters who were never allowed to speak freely, who flinched at their mother's voice, who seemed more like porcelain dolls than flesh and blood. One by one, the suitors disappeared. Years began to slip away. In a time when young women were often married by 17, the widow's daughters entered their 20s unwed. A dangerous age in the eyes of society. Rumors began to spread. Perhaps there was madness in the family, perhaps the daughters were barren, perhaps the widow herself had driven away all respectable prospects. Each whisper cut deeper, wounding not only the daughters' reputations, but the widow's pride. Inside the house, the air grew tense. The daughters bore the brunt of their mother's anxieties. Every missed proposal, every passing year, was turned against them. They became the scapegoats for her fears of extinction. Meals at the long dining table were taken in silence. The only sounds the clinking of silverware and the widow's sighs of disappointment. The daughters tried, in their own ways, to resist the weight pressing upon them. The eldest obeyed, believing obedience was survival. The middle daughter wrote secret letters to a cousin in another city, confiding her fears, though the letters were never sent. And the youngest prayed at night, her whispered words asking for deliverance. From a mother she dared not openly defy, but prayer did not change the reality that bore down upon them. The widow's obsession with legacy grew stronger. With every passing season, she walked the halls at night, counting portraits of ancestors, imagining empty frames where her daughter's children should one day be. Her paranoia twisted into certainty. If her daughters could not secure husbands, then the family name would wither and die. And in her mind, that fate was unacceptable. She began to view her daughters not as children, not as women with lives of their own, but as vessels. Vessels that must fulfill their purpose. Vessels that must bear heirs, by any means necessary. The daughters felt the change before they understood it. Their mother's gaze grew sharper, colder, lingering on them as though she was measuring not their beauty, but their usefulness. Conversations shifted from polite reminders about suitors to cryptic remarks about duty, about sacrifice, about the price of bloodlines. At night, behind closed doors, the daughters whispered to one another. The eldest urged silence. Resistance would only bring punishment. The middle daughter wept quietly into her pillow, fearful of what her mother's words meant. And the youngest, though frightened, still dared to ask questions no one else would. What if mother no longer cares about marriage? What if she has another plan? The house itself seemed to tighten around them, each locked door, each curtained window, a reminder that escape was impossible. Servants moved more cautiously, sensing tension in the air. Some swore they heard muffled arguments through the walls. Others claimed the widow spent hours alone in her study, writing letters she never allowed anyone else to deliver. The daughters did not yet know it, but their fates were no longer tied to society's rules. They were tied to their mother's will, and that will was about to drag them into a nightmare they could neither choose nor escape. Their lives, once defined by absence, of freedom, of affection, of love, were about to be defined by something far darker, because the widow had stopped waiting for suitors. She had stopped hoping for respectable marriages. She had begun to imagine another path, a path where men could be bought, a path where heirs could be forced into existence, and soon she would set her plan into motion. By the spring of 1852, the widow had stopped pretending. The dinners where she once spoke of suitors and family alliances were over. The polite invitations to eligible bachelors had ceased. In their place came silence, broken only by the scratch of her pen and the rustle of letters sealed in wax. No longer was she waiting for society to grant her daughters husbands. Society had failed her. Now she would take matters into her own hands. The plan, when it first bloomed in her mind, was grotesque. Yet the longer she sat with it, the more reasonable it seemed. Why should she beg for her daughters' futures to be decided by men of standing who had already scorned them? Why should her fortune lie idle when it could be used to secure her bloodline in another way? Money, after all, was power, and with power even morality could be bent. Her first step was discretion. She summoned one of the family's most trusted servants, a man who had served her late husband faithfully. With a voice that carried no emotion, she instructed him to make inquiries, not among Boston's elite, but among its forgotten corners. Boarding houses, taverns, docks where immigrants lingered desperate for work, the kind of places where men were young, strong, and most importantly, poor. The instructions were simple. Find men with nothing to lose. Offer them coin, enough to feed themselves for months. In return, they would provide something greater than labor. They would provide seed. The servant hesitated, of course. Even in a city where hypocrisy thrived, this command felt unholy. But the widow's gaze was sharp, unyielding. To disobey her meant ruin. And so he carried her message into the shadows of Boston, where desperation outweighed conscience. It did not take long. Poverty was abundant, and hunger sharpens the willingness to compromise. Young men, farmhands without land, sailors between voyages, Irish immigrants shunned by polite society, listened carefully when coin was mentioned. Few asked questions. Fewer still refused. The promise of gold outweighed the unease that flickered in their eyes when the details were explained. Meanwhile, in the mansion, the daughters began to sense the shift. Their mother grew more watchful, her words more cryptic. A family must be preserved, she would whisper at breakfast. Blood must not be wasted. The daughters exchanged glances, unsettled yet powerless. The truth revealed itself slowly. One evening, the eldest daughter stumbled upon a letter left half open on her mother's desk. The words were clear enough: a meeting, discreet arrangements, payment upon completion. Her hands trembled as she read. She dared not confront her mother, but she knew now that something unspeakable was coming. Days later, the first of the chosen men was brought to the estate under cover of night. He was ushered in quietly, as if he were no more than a shadow slipping through the halls. The daughters did not see him then, but they heard whispers among the servants, footsteps where no visitors should have been. The widow explained nothing. She did not need to. Her will was absolute, her authority unquestioned. When the daughters asked, she silenced them with a single look, her lips pressed into a thin line that forbade further questions. Yet their silence did not mask their terror. At night, they huddled in one another's rooms, whispering their fears, their hearts pounding as they tried to piece together the truth. The youngest spoke aloud the thought that none dared to voice. Mother intends to use us, not for marriage, not for love. For heirs, the weight of it crushed them. To live as prisoners of reputation was one thing. To become unwilling vessels in their mother's scheme was another. But what could they do? They were women in 1852, without rights, without choices, bound by duty to a mother who saw them as instruments of legacy rather than daughters of flesh and blood. The first encounter was arranged soon after. One of the young men, a dock worker with calloused hands and hollow eyes, was brought into the house. He was promised coin and sworn to silence. What he felt, what the daughters felt, mattered little to the widow. All that mattered was the outcome. All that mattered was proof of fertility, the continuation of blood. The house, once silent with grief, now pulsed with a strange tension. Servants exchanged wary looks, pretending not to hear the muffled sounds that echoed down the halls at night. They knew better than to speak. The widow's fortune was their livelihood, and to question her was to risk everything. For the daughters, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Their childhoods had already been consumed by their mother's control. Now even their womanhood was no longer their own. They were reduced to nothing more than vessels for a legacy they had never asked to preserve. And yet the widow believed she was doing what must be done. In her mind there was no cruelty, only necessity. She told herself that history would forgive her, that her descendants, yet unborn, would one day thank her for her determination. But Boston was not blind. Though the widow thought herself discreet, whispers had a way of escaping even the thickest walls. Neighbors noticed strange figures slipping into the estate at odd hours. Servants muttered behind closed doors, and rumors once born are impossible to silence. The arrangement was no longer a secret. It was a scandal waiting to erupt. The night the first man was led into the mansion, the air seemed heavier, as though the very walls of the house understood the weight of what was about to happen. He was not a man of wealth or education. He was a dock worker, his hands calloused, his boots worn thin, his face unshaven from days of labor. Poverty clung to him like a second skin. And yet, in the widow's eyes, he had something more valuable than any Harvard degree or gilded inheritance: youth, virility, and desperation. The servant guided him through the side entrance, where shadows concealed his presence. Coins had already exchanged hands, the promise of more waiting should he comply. His instructions were simple: no questions, no words, no acknowledgement beyond what was necessary. Silence, obedience, and an oath of secrecy. Upstairs in a locked chamber, the eldest daughter sat trembling. She had been told nothing. Her mother never wasted words, but she knew what was expected. The realization made her skin crawl. She had begged her mother earlier that evening, voice breaking with desperation. "Please, Mother. Don't make me do this. Don't." Her mother's hand had silenced her, a sharp slap across the cheek. The widow's voice was colder than the stone beneath their feet. "You will do as I say. A daughter's duty is to a bloodline. You will not shame this family further." And so the daughter waited, heart racing, until the door opened, and the stranger stepped inside. His eyes did not meet hers. He too seemed ashamed, but shame was powerless against hunger. What followed was not love, not passion, not even cruelty in the traditional sense. It was transaction, mechanical, lifeless, an exchange of coin for flesh. When it was done, the man left quickly as though fleeing from the weight of what he had done. He did not look back. The servant pressed more silver into his hand, and he vanished into the night. The daughter curled into herself, sobbing silently into her pillow, while her mother, waiting in the hall, asked only one question: was it done? The servant nodded. The widow gave no comfort to her daughter, no acknowledgement of her tears. Instead, she recorded the night in a small, leather-bound ledger. The family name must continue, and she would track every step until it did. But one transaction was not enough. The following week, another man was summoned, this one an Irish immigrant, fresh off the ship, hungry for work, but despised by the city's elites. For him, the widow's offer was a lifeline, a means of survival in a place that treated him as an outcast. He accepted the bargain eagerly, even if it meant stepping into a world of sin whispered only in confessions. This time, it was the second daughter. She fought harder than her sister, screaming when she realized what was happening, clawing at the door when it shut behind her. The widow's voice cut through her cries. "Do not disgrace yourself further. This is your purpose. You will thank me when your children are born." The girl's pleas turned to muffled sobs as the door was bolted from outside. The man, torn between pity and his own hunger for survival, did not linger. He too left with his share of coins and silence. By the third transaction, even the servants could no longer pretend ignorance. They cleaned sheets, disposed of evidence, and kept their mouths shut, for their loyalty was bound by gold as much as fear. Some whispered that the widow had lost her mind, that grief had twisted her soul into something monstrous. Others believed she was cursed, touched by something darker than grief, something unholy. The youngest daughter's turn came last. She was barely of age, fragile in frame, her innocence still intact. When she realized her fate, she fell to her knees at her mother's feet. "Please, mother, I'll do anything, marry anyone, just not this." But the widow, unmoved, only adjusted the rings on her fingers and spoke with chilling certainty. "A woman's body is not her own. It belongs to her family, to her children, to her bloodline. You will not waste yours." The girl wept until her body shook, but her mother's decision was final. That night, another man entered, another transaction was made, and the youngest daughter learned the same cruel lesson as her sisters. In her mother's eyes, she was not flesh and blood, but a vessel. By the end of the summer of 1852, the ledger contained names, dates, and payments. Each entry was marked with precision, as though the widow were recording not shame, but triumph. Yet outside the mansion walls, whispers had grown louder. Neighbors spoke of strange men slipping in and out of the estate at ungodly hours. Servants who left their posts carried tales with them into taverns and alleys. Boston society, already suspicious of the widow's cold demeanor, now had fuel for scandal. But the widow did not care. She believed she was untouchable, shielded by her fortune and her ruthless will. To her, the daughter's tears were insignificant compared to the future she imagined. Grandchildren carrying her blood. Heirs who would reclaim the respect society had denied her. What she failed to see was that every coin she handed over, every man she summoned, was not a step toward salvation but a march toward ruin. For scandals like debts cannot remain hidden forever. It began with the servants. Servants always know first. They see the comings and goings, hear the muffled sobs through closed doors, smell the sweat and shame that no coin can erase. For weeks they had tried to ignore it, convincing themselves that loyalty demanded silence. But silence is heavy, and in Boston of 1852, silence was a luxury few could afford. One maid, dismissed suddenly after speaking too freely, carried her bitterness to a boarding house. There, by candlelight, she whispered of strange men arriving at the widow's mansion late at night. Dock workers, drifters, immigrants with dirt still on their boots. Why would such men visit one of Boston's most respectable houses? Why did the widow's daughters, once seen in church every Sunday, now rarely leave their home? The whispers spread like a slow fire. In the taverns near the harbor, men claimed they had seen coins pressed into calloused hands, doors opened at ungodly hours, young women led away in silence. Some laughed, saying the widow was mad with grief. Others shuddered, muttering that no good could come from a woman who defied both church and nature. And then came the clergy. Boston's priests had long suspected something unholy in that house. The widow, though wealthy, was seldom seen in pews. Her daughters appeared pale, withdrawn, and their absence became more glaring with each passing week. One priest, troubled by rumor, attempted a visit under the guise of offering prayer. The widow met him at the door herself, her smile polite, but her eyes as cold as marble. "God has no business in my affairs," she said curtly, and the door closed before the priest could step inside. That sentence alone was enough to ignite suspicion into frenzy. A wealthy woman refusing God's blessing was one thing, but to refuse his scrutiny, that was proof of wickedness. From pulpits, sermons grew harsher. The city was warned of hidden sins festering within even the most respectable walls. The widow's mansion was not named aloud, but all knew where the priest's gaze lingered when he spoke of corruption and the fall of women. Meanwhile, the daughters became prisoners. When they appeared at the windows, neighbors noted their hollow cheeks, their haunted stares. One child passing in the street swore he heard crying carried on the night air, though his mother silenced him with a sharp tug of the hand. Respectable families did not discuss such things. Respectable families pretended not to see. But respectability has limits. By autumn, A rumor had taken shape sharp enough to wound, that the widow had abandoned all decency, that she was paying men to lay with her daughters, that she was so obsessed with heirs that she had turned her own home into a brothel of bloodlines. The men who had entered her home were not all discreet. One, drunk in a tavern, boasted of the silver he had earned and the fine house where it was paid. He spoke too loudly, too carelessly, and though his words were dismissed as drunken rambling by some, others carried them eagerly into Boston's tightly wound society. The scandal now belonged not to whispers, but to conversation. Women lowered their voices when the widow's carriage passed. Men exchanged glances over newspapers, and the daughters' names, once spoken with polite curiosity, were now spat with pity, disdain, or morbid fascination. The widow knew, of course. She always knew. Servants carried gossip to her ears. Neighbors' glances lingered too long. Letters from former acquaintances arrived with polite refusals to dine or visit. She did not care, or rather she told herself she did not care. To her, gossip was the envy of small minds. Her ledger, with its names and coins and cycles carefully tracked, mattered more than the mutterings of priests and drunks. But the daughters felt the weight of it. They overheard their names in market stalls, sensed the shame in every glance that lingered too long. The eldest stopped leaving the house altogether, refusing even to walk the garden paths for fear of being seen. The second daughter, more defiant, once shouted at her mother that they were being ruined, that the whole city knew. She was struck across the face so hard she bled, and the subject was never raised again. Still, the rumors sharpened. By winter they had taken the shape of certainty. People no longer asked if the stories were true, but how far they had gone. Did the daughters carry children now? Did the widow keep a hidden nursery within her walls? The scandal grew monstrous in the telling, until truth and invention blurred into one grotesque tapestry. And yet, in the eyes of Boston society, invention mattered little. What mattered was that the widow had defied them, had flouted their moral codes, had lived as though wealth could shield her from God and man alike. Such arrogance demanded punishment, if not by law, then by reputation. The widow's name became a stain, whispered in boarding houses, scrawled in crude tavern jokes, muttered in church pews. The daughters were spoken of as lost souls, their innocence bartered away by a mother who prized bloodline above all else. And while the widow maintained her icy composure, her empire of silence was crumbling. For secrets may be bought, but scandals are always free. The mansion had grown colder. Not in temperature. Fires still burned in the hearth, and the widow's fortune ensured no expense was spared on comforts, but in spirit. The walls seemed to listen now, carrying secrets like veins carrying poison. Every door creak, every muffled footstep felt like an accusation. The daughters lived like prisoners. Their days blurred into silence, their only freedoms found in fleeting moments of solitude. Yet within that silence, rebellion began, not in shouts or open defiance, but in whispers, in scratches of ink, in the quiet violence of despair. The eldest daughter, once meek and obedient, turned inward. She began writing in a journal, a small leather-bound book she kept hidden beneath her mattress. In its pages she recorded her pain in trembling script, her mother's cruelty, the shame she could not wash from her skin, the nights when men entered her chamber, and she felt her soul retreat into darkness. One entry read, "We are not daughters anymore. We are vessels. Mother has hollowed us out and filled us with her hunger. I pray each night for death, for escape, but God does not answer." Her words, though unseen by others, were rebellion enough, a testament that she had not surrendered completely. The second daughter fought differently. She spoke when she should have been silent, argued when silence was demanded. Once, when her mother reminded her that her duty was to carry the future of the family, she spat back, her voice trembling with rage. "Then you carry it. You let the men into your chamber. You know nothing of what you ask us to endure." The slap that followed split her lip, but she did not cry. Instead, she smiled through blood, a defiance that rattled even the widow for a brief moment. The youngest daughter, fragile and quiet, rebelled in the most dangerous way of all, by withdrawing from life itself. Food went untouched, her body grew frail, and her eyes lost their light. At night she whispered prayers not for salvation but for an end. She was the first to speak aloud the word her sisters only thought in terror: suicide. She did not attempt it, not yet, but the word hung heavy in the air, a possibility more haunting than any priest's sermon. Together, the sisters shared their grief in secret conversations, speaking in hushed tones behind locked doors. They plotted escape, though none of them knew where to go. Boston was no refuge. The scandal had already poisoned their names. Who would take them in? Who would believe them? And yet still they dreamed. Sometimes they whispered of running to the docks, boarding a ship bound for Europe, leaving their mother and her fortune behind. Other nights, in darker moods, they spoke of burning the ledger where their mother recorded each transaction, as though destroying those pages might undo what had been done. But dreams dissolved when the widow entered the room. She was ever watchful, her presence like a shadow that consumed all light. She inspected them as though they were livestock, noting their health, their cycles, their usefulness. Her daughter's rebellion, no matter how quiet, did not escape her notice. "You think you suffer?" she said once, standing over them in the drawing room, her fingers tightening on the cane she now carried. "You know nothing of suffering. I buried your father. I bore the scorn of this city. I carry the weight of a name you are too weak to uphold. If you must bleed for this family, then bleed." Her words cut deeper than the cane ever could. The eldest daughter clutched her journal tighter that night, writing until her fingers cramped. She began to imagine someone someday reading her words and finally understanding the truth, that they had not gone quietly, that their silence had not been consent. The second daughter began to watch her mother more closely, memorizing the keys she carried, the way the ledger never left her sight. Defiance grew in her like a flame, small but persistent, waiting for the chance to spark into something more. The youngest grew weaker. Some nights her sisters found her staring at the open window, the moonlight on her pale face, her body swaying ever so slightly, as though she might let herself fall into the darkness below. They pulled her back each time, whispering promises of survival, of escape. Though even they struggled to believe their own words, Boston outside continued to whisper too, the scandal swelling like a storm. Yet within the mansion, another storm brewed, one of quiet resistance, of daughters who refused to surrender completely to the monstrous will of their mother. Their rebellion was silent, but it was rebellion nonetheless. And though the widow believed her control was absolute, cracks were forming in the empire she had built on flesh and fear, cracks that would soon split wide open. It happened, as such things often do, in a tavern. The man was young, barely past 20, his Irish accent thickened by whiskey. His pockets were heavy with silver, and his tongue looser than it should have been. Among the crowd of sailors and dockhands, he boasted, not of his strength nor his work, but of the house that paid him. "A grand place, finer than any of us'll ever own," he said, slamming his mug on the table. "Curtains like royalty, floors you could eat off. And the lady of the house, rich as a queen. She pays in silver, no questions asked." His companions jeered, demanded details, but it was his next words that turned laughter into silence. "She paid me to lie with her daughters." The tavern went still. One man crossed himself. Another spat on the floor, muttering a curse, for even in a city hardened by poverty and vice, there were lines one did not cross. The drunkard laughed, mistaking their horror for disbelief. "It's the truth. The widow herself arranges it. Says the family name must live on. I've been there twice. Others have too. Ask any lad in need of coin." By morning, the story had left the tavern walls and taken to the streets. Words travel quickly when they carry sin. By midday, servants whispered of it in kitchens. Seamstresses repeated it over their needles, and merchants muttered it beneath their breath. By nightfall, it had reached the pulpit. The priest, who had once been turned away from the widow's door, thundered at his congregation with fire in his eyes. He spoke of immorality so brazen it mocked God himself. He did not name her, but everyone knew. They always knew. The press seized the tale with greed. Newspapers printed lurid headlines. Immorality in high society, widow accused of unholy acts. Daughters ensnared in scandalous arrangements. Boston's shame hides behind closed doors. The stories varied in detail, some exaggerated, others nearly accurate, but all shared the same conclusion. A wealthy widow had turned her own household into a house of sin, using her daughters as tools for her twisted ambition. The daughters, pale and withdrawn, became ghostly figures in the public imagination. Some papers painted them as victims, innocent lambs sacrificed at the altar of their mother's greed. Others, more cruel, insinuated that they were complicit, temptresses cloaked in wealth who had lured men into sin. The widow herself became a spectacle. Where once her carriage commanded respect, now it attracted jeers. Crowds gathered outside her gates, shouting curses, throwing rotten vegetables. Children whispered tales of the witch widow who paid men to defile her daughters, and women crossed themselves when her name was spoken. Inside the mansion, chaos reigned. The daughters wept at the sound of shouting beyond the walls, their shame no longer private, but a public feast. Servants fled their posts, unwilling to be associated with a household branded in sin. Letters arrived daily, not of sympathy but of condemnation, some laced with threats. The widow, however, did not bend. She stood tall in her drawing room, newspaper clutched in her hand, her face carved in cold marble. "Let them talk," she told her daughters, her voice steady despite the venom that surrounded them. "They are envious. They always have been. Their whispers cannot erase our bloodline." But even she felt the shift. Wealth had shielded her from much, but wealth could not shield her from scandal. Boston society, so obsessed with appearances, turned its back on her. The same women who once dined at her table now refused her letters. The same men who once sought her fortune now cursed her name in parlors and gentlemen's clubs. The daughters' rebellion, once silent, grew louder beneath the weight of public shame. The second daughter confronted her mother in the dead of night, her hands shaking as she held one of the newspapers. "Do you see what you've done to us? We are ruined. Ruined in the eyes of everyone. We will never marry, never be free. Your greed has damned us." The widow's eyes burned with fury, but for the first time her hand did not rise to strike. She turned away instead, staring into the fire as though it alone might answer. Still, the city would not relent. Each day the scandal grew, each headline bolder, each whisper more cruel. What had begun as rumor was now an open wound across Boston's reputation, and the widow's house had become its festering symbol. She believed herself unbreakable, but she was wrong, for scandal is not satisfied with whispers. Scandal demands ruin, and ruin was coming. The court of public opinion struck first. By winter, the widow could no longer leave her house without encountering jeers. Her once pristine carriage, polished black with gold trim, became a moving target for rotten fruit and stones. Children shouted obscenities as it passed. Neighbors who once bowed their heads in respect now spat on the ground when her name was spoken. The newspapers, sensing profit, fed the fire daily. Each new edition brought bolder accusations, more lurid tales. "The widow's brothel of bloodline," one headline declared. "Daughters sold for fortune," cried another. Whether true or false, it mattered little. In the public eye, she was guilty. The clergy sharpened their sermons to a blade. From pulpits across Boston, her name was not spoken, but her sins were painted in fire and brimstone. Priests thundered that she had mocked God, turned her daughters into harlots, and brought shame upon the city itself. Congregations nodded, some in horror, others in satisfaction. For what could be more thrilling than the fall of the mighty? The widow ignored it at first. She still kept her ledger, still counted coins, still muttered of heirs and bloodlines. But her daughters saw what she could not. They saw how their names had become poison, how no man of standing would ever come near them, how their future was as ruined as the family's reputation. The second daughter shouted at her one evening, her voice raw with fury. "You wanted us to be vessels for your legacy. Well, now we are nothing. You've destroyed us, mother. There will be no heirs, only shame." The eldest sobbed quietly beside her, clutching her journal as if it were the last piece of herself she still owned. The youngest sat pale and silent, staring at the fire as if already lost to it. For the first time, the widow did not respond. Her cane trembled in her hand. Her eyes, once cold as stone, flickered with something unrecognizable: fear. But fear could not save her. Soon the law followed the whispers. She was summoned before magistrates, not for charges of immorality. There was no law for such sins, but for debts unpaid, for bribes whispered to have greased the silence of servants, for indecent conduct that skirted the edges of statute. Each court appearance was a spectacle, the room packed with onlookers eager to watch her dignity stripped away. She sat tall in the dock, refusing to bow her head. Yet her words, once sharp and commanding, now rang hollow against the tide of disdain. Her wealth bought her no allies. No lawyer of standing would take her case without shame. When one witness, a dock worker she had once paid, took the stand, the room erupted in murmurs. He described the coins, the secrecy, the instructions whispered in candlelight. Though his testimony wavered under cross-examination, the damage was done. The crowd jeered, some shouting curses, others laughing at her disgrace. The widow returned home each evening paler than before. Her fortune, once vast, drained away in legal fees, bribes, and the endless cost of keeping her house afloat in a city that wanted nothing more than to see it burn. Inside, the daughters withered. The youngest fell ill, her body weakened by months of despair and malnourishment. The eldest no longer wrote in her journal. Her ink ran dry, her will fading. The second daughter raged still, but her fury had turned inward, cutting her more deeply than any slap ever had. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, decayed from within. Curtains went unwashed, fires burned lower, servants abandoned their posts one by one. Silence filled its halls, broken only by the widow's footsteps as she roamed the corridors at night, muttering to herself about legacy, about heirs that would never come. And Boston watched. Boston waited. Boston delighted in her ruin. By the year's end, the widow was no longer a figure of power, but a pariah. Her invitations went unanswered. Her fortune, though not gone, had become useless. No amount of gold could purchase back respect, reputation, or love. She was alone, surrounded by daughters who hated her, haunted by a city that had marked her name forever in shame. The downfall was complete. Not in the clang of prison bars or the signing of decrees, but in something far crueler: silence. She had fought so hard to create a legacy, yet what remained was nothing but scandal. Whispered in taverns, scrawled in papers, carved into the memory of Boston like a scar. The widow's empire of bloodline had rotted from within, and what followed was not redemption, but the slow, suffocating weight of disgrace. History does not always remember the powerful for their triumphs. Sometimes it remembers them for their sins. The widow of Boston, her name never spoken aloud in polite company, her fortune never fully traced, her daughters never restored, became less a person than a cautionary tale. She was reduced to whispers, a story told in drawing rooms and taverns alike, often prefaced with a glance over the shoulder, as if even decades later, her scandal carried a curse. The city had seen wealthy men destroy themselves in gambling dens, politicians fall in bribery scandals, ministers ousted for secret affairs. But the widow was different. She was remembered not because she sinned against God or law, but because she sinned against blood. She had dared to corrupt what Boston valued most: lineage, legacy, the sanctity of family itself, and for that she was never forgiven. Her mansion, once the pride of Beacon Hill, decayed in plain sight. Windows shattered, curtains hung in tatters, vines crept up its bricks. Passers-by pointed at it like a haunted relic. Children whispered that ghosts of her daughters peered from its windows at night. Few dared to walk too close after dark. It stood not as a home, but as a tombstone. The daughters, 3 lives spent in the shadow of one woman's obsession, vanished into obscurity. The eldest, who once wrote her sorrows in secret, died unmarried, her journal eventually found in a trunk decades later. Its ink faded, its words soaked with despair. The second, so full of fury, never bore children of her own, choosing silence over continuation. The youngest, frail and broken by illness, was buried before her 25th year, her grave unmarked, her name swallowed by time. Not one heir came from the widow's grand scheme. The bloodline she fought so ruthlessly to preserve ended in silence. Her fortune, once envied, scattered into the hands of lawyers, creditors, and scavengers. Coins that once bought silence now bought nothing but dust. By the turn of the century, not a trace of her wealth remained, save for rumors that a servant had fled with a chest of gold and vanished into the West. But wealth was never the true legacy. Shame was. For years, Boston mothers told their daughters the story of the widow as a warning. Do not let ambition make you cruel. Do not let wealth make you blind. Priests spoke her name as if it were a parable. Even gossip mongers, decades after her death, repeated her scandal with a mixture of horror and delight. And still, her ghost lingered. Not the ghost of rattling chains or flickering candles, but something subtler, colder. The ghost of memory. Her name became a curse whispered in boarding schools, a shiver in the dark corners of the city. When fortunes collapsed or families fell into disgrace, people muttered, "It is the widow's curse." Her shame touches all who forget the cost of sin. For generations, her daughter's tragedy lived on in Boston's folklore. In old newspapers, their names appeared only as initials, E, C, and L, erased even in death, defined only by the scandal that ruined them. The widow had wanted heirs. What she left instead were echoes, and echoes can be louder than legacies. To this day, historians debate how much of the tale was true. Were the daughters truly forced? Were young men truly paid to fulfill her design? Or was some of it invention, fueled by gossip and moral panic in a city quick to judge? The answer hardly matters. What matters is that Boston believed it. What matters is that it was remembered. The story of the widow became less about her and more about us, about the cruelty that hides in ambition, the cost of silencing innocence, the hunger for legacy that devours the living. And in the end, the tale closes with no redemption, only a chilling truth that power without compassion corrupts not only the present, but the future itself. The widow's house has long since crumbled. The stones were carted away, the land repurposed. Yet if you stand on that patch of Beacon Hill at dusk, some say you can still feel it. The weight of eyes, the echo of footsteps, the lingering scent of candle wax and decay. A dynasty never born, a fortune never secured.